In the spring of 1839, Margaret Whitmore stood at her bedroom window at Ashland Grove Plantation in South Carolina, watching a young enslaved woman named Celia work in the garden below. Margaret had been married to plantation owner Thomas Whitmore for 7 years. 7 years of trying, 7 years of failure, 7 years of watching her husband's patience thin with every passing month that she remained childless. In elite Southern society, a wife's primary duty was producing heirs. Without children, Margaret wasn't just failing her husband, she was failing to justify her existence. Thomas had already begun making casual comments about his cousin whose wife had given him 4 sons. Pointed silences when neighbor families arrived with their children in tow. Margaret felt herself becoming invisible in her own home, a decorative failure taking up space meant for a more productive woman. But Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who accepted defeat easily. And as she watched 19-year-old Celia move through the garden, an idea took shape, an idea so audacious that it would remain hidden for 12 years and reshape the lives of everyone it touched. What Margaret was contemplating had no name in 1839. What we'd now call surrogacy didn't exist as a concept. But Margaret wasn't thinking in modern terms. She was thinking in plantation terms, where enslaved women's bodies were already controlled and exploited, where the line between person and property had been so thoroughly erased that almost anything seemed possible. The idea was simple in its cruelty. Margaret would arrange for Thomas to impregnate Celia, then claim the resulting child as her own. A false pregnancy, a substitution, a theft of maternity that would preserve Margaret's status while denying Celia not just her child, but even the acknowledgement that she had given birth at all. Margaret began her deception with methodical precision. First, she announced to Thomas that she was with child, using classic pregnancy symptoms to buy herself time. Morning sickness, fatigue, sensitivity to smells. Thomas, desperate for an heir after 7 barren years, wanted so badly to believe that he accepted every claim without question. Then came the delicate matter of Celia. Margaret had selected her carefully, young, healthy, and crucially, with no close family ties on the plantation. Her mother had been sold years earlier. Margaret summoned her to the main house under the pretense of training her as a personal maid. What Margaret actually needed was proximity, control, and absolute secrecy. The conversation Margaret had with Celia in that small room has been partially reconstructed from testimony Celia gave decades later to a Freedmen's Bureau interviewer. Margaret didn't ask, she informed the master would be visiting Celia's room on specific nights. Celia would comply. When Celia became pregnant, she would remain hidden until the child was born. Then Margaret would take the infant and Celia would return to the fields as if nothing had happened. Celia understood immediately what this meant. She was being forced to endure rape, for that's what it was. Even if 1839 law didn't recognize that enslaved women could be raped and then surrender the resulting child without ever claiming it. She had no choice. Refusal meant punishment, possibly sale, certainly something worse. Thomas never questioned why his wife insisted he visit the maids' quarters on certain evenings. Men of his class didn't question their access to enslaved women's bodies. It was so normalized that Margaret's arrangement simply seemed like a wife managing the household efficiently. Thomas didn't know he was being manipulated into creating an heir through a woman who wasn't his wife. By July 1839, Celia was pregnant. Margaret performed pregnancy for anyone watching, patting her dresses, complaining of baby movements, consulting with doctors about her delicate condition. Everything was about creating a believable narrative that would make the eventual appearance of a baby seem natural. Celia, meanwhile, was kept almost entirely hidden. She no longer appeared in the fields or around other enslaved workers. The few people who saw her were told she was being punished for disobedience. This explanation satisfied casual curiosity. Enslaved people disappeared into punishment all the time. No one looked deeper. Margaret found her accomplice in an enslaved midwife named Ruth, who had delivered babies on Ashland Grove for 20 years. Ruth understood the stakes. Refusing to participate would mean punishment, possibly death. She also knew that no one would believe her if she tried to expose Margaret's scheme. Ruth agreed to deliver Celia's baby and present it to Margaret as her own on March 3, 1840. Celia went into labor. Margaret had sent Thomas to Charleston on fabricated plantation business, ensuring he'd be gone for at least a week. The house was cleared of all servants except Ruth. For those hours, the main house contained only 3 people: the woman actually giving birth, the woman pretending to give birth, and the midwife forced to facilitate the deception. Celia labored for 14 hours. Ruth attended her with professional competence but emotional distance. She couldn't afford to get attached to a baby she knew would be stolen the moment it emerged. The baby was a girl, healthy, perfect, brown-skinned with a head of black curls. The child's dark complexion made Margaret's deception vulnerable. This baby didn't look like Thomas, didn't look convincingly white. But Margaret had anticipated this. She'd researched stories of babies born dark who lightened with age. She'd invented an entire fictional Italian grandmother whose Mediterranean coloring supposedly explained any darkness in the baby's features. She'd even procured a portrait she claimed was this mythical ancestor. Ruth cut the umbilical cord, cleaned the baby, and handed her not to Celia, who lay exhausted and empty-armed on the bed, but to Margaret, who stood waiting in the doorway. Celia turned her face to the wall. She never held her daughter, never named her, was never allowed to claim her. Margaret named the child Abigail. She spent 3 days establishing the fiction of postpartum recovery, then emerged with the baby to receive congratulations from Thomas, who returned from Charleston to find himself suddenly a father. His joy was complete. He never questioned the baby's appearance, never doubted the story, never knew he'd been deceived. Celia was returned to the fields within a week. Margaret couldn't afford to keep her close. The risk of someone noticing the physical aftermath of childbirth was too high. Better to separate mother and daughter immediately. Completely. Celia went back to picking cotton. Abigail grew up in the main house, dressed in fine clothes, educated by tutors, raised as a white plantation daughter with all the privileges that status conveyed. But maintaining the deception required constant vigilance. Margaret couldn't allow Celia and Abigail to interact. When Abigail was 3 and began playing in gardens where field workers could see her, Margaret convinced Thomas to sell Celia to a neighboring plantation, removing the threat entirely. Celia was sold in 1843 for $800. She went to a plantation 15 miles away, close enough that she could sometimes hear news of Ashland Grove, far enough that she'd never lay eyes on her daughter again. Thomas never questioned it. He didn't know he was selling his own daughter's mother. Abigail grew up believing Margaret was her mother. She had no memory of Celia, no awareness that her entire identity was built on theft and lies. She learned piano, how to manage servants, how to conduct herself with the grace expected of elite Southern womanhood. Everything about her upbringing reinforced the fiction of her legitimacy. But biology doesn't cooperate with social fictions. As Abigail aged, her features became increasingly difficult to explain. Her skin remained darker than either parent's. Her hair grew thick and coarse with a curl pattern that didn't match European ancestry. By the time she turned 12 in 1852, Abigail looked undeniably mixed race, a truth Margaret could no longer explain away. The breaking point came at a social gathering in May 1852. Abigail was 12, approaching the age when elite girls began considering marriage prospects. The Whitmores hosted a party at Ashland Grove, but the whispers that had always existed suddenly became impossible to ignore. One woman commented on Abigail's exotic features. Another noted she looked nothing like either parent. The social rejection was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas confronted Margaret that night. The conversation was documented in Margaret's journal. Thomas demanded to know why their daughter looked increasingly unlike them. Margaret tried to deflect, but Thomas had spent 12 years noticing what he'd trained himself not to see. Margaret broke. She told Thomas the truth. All of it. The false pregnancy, the arrangement with Celia, the stolen baby, the 12 years of deception. Thomas's reaction surprised Margaret. He didn't rage, he didn't reject Abigail. Instead, he focused on the practical problem. What to do with a daughter who looked increasingly black in a society where racial purity determined everything. They couldn't admit the truth publicly without destroying their social position and, more importantly, without reducing Abigail from a free white girl to a mixed-race person with questionable legal status. In 1852 South Carolina, revealing Abigail's ancestry would strip her of every privilege she'd ever known. So Thomas and Margaret made a different choice. They decided to send Abigail north. They'd place her in a Pennsylvania boarding school where her ambiguous features might be overlooked, where she could potentially pass as fully white among strangers. It was exile dressed as opportunity. Abigail was told she was receiving a superior education. She was 13 and excited. She didn't know she was being hidden, didn't know her parents had concluded she was unsalvageable in Southern society. She left Ashland Grove in September 1853 and enrolled in a girls' academy outside Philadelphia, believing the carefully constructed story of her Italian heritage. Back at Ashland Grove, Margaret and Thomas settled into silence. They never had other children. They never spoke of Celia again. They maintained the public fiction that Abigail was away at school while privately acknowledging their daughter was in exile because of Margaret's deception. The truth might have remained buried forever if not for the Civil War. When Union forces occupied South Carolina in 1865, newly freed people began searching for family members. Celia, now 45 years old, started asking questions about Ashland Grove. She'd heard rumors for years, whispers among enslaved people about the white girl at the Whitmore Plantation, who looked suspiciously like Celia herself in 1866. Celia walked to Ashland Grove as a free woman. The war had ended. Slavery was abolished. The Whitmore's power had collapsed. Celia demanded to know what had happened to the baby she'd been forced to bear in 1840. Margaret, diminished by war and age, admitted the truth. She told Celia about Abigail, about raising her for 12 years, about sending her north when the deception became unsustainable. She gave Celia the address of the Philadelphia boarding school and Abigail's last known location. What happened next has been documented in Freedmen's Bureau records. Celia traveled north in 1867, searching for the daughter she'd never known. She found Abigail in a Pennsylvania town, living as a white woman married to a merchant, raising 2 children, completely unaware of her true origins. Celia didn't reveal herself immediately. She observed from a distance, watching the woman her daughter had become, a woman whose entire life was built on the theft of Celia's maternity. And Celia faced an impossible choice: claim her daughter and destroy the life Abigail had built, or remain silent and allow the deception to continue. Celia chose partial truth. She approached Abigail not as her mother, but as a woman who'd worked at Ashland Grove and knew her family history. She told Abigail there were questions about her parentage, that Margaret wasn't her biological mother, that her origins were complicated. Abigail's reaction was documented in a letter discovered in 1978. She was devastated, furious, terrified. The revelation threatened everything: her marriage, her children's legitimacy, her social standing, her very sense of self. She begged Celia not to reveal more, not to expose her. And Celia agreed. She returned to South Carolina without publicly claiming her daughter, without demanding recognition, without seeking justice. The Freedmen's Bureau interviewer who recorded Celia's testimony in 1868 asked why she didn't fight for acknowledgement. Celia's response has become one of the most haunting documents of the post-war period. What good would it do? She's lived 28 years as a white woman. I lived 28 years as a slave. We're both what we were made to be. Claiming her now would just destroy her without fixing me. Margaret Whitmore died in 1871 without ever publicly acknowledging her deception. Thomas died in 1874. Abigail continued living as a white woman in Pennsylvania until her death in 1893, raising children and grandchildren who never knew their ancestor was an enslaved woman. Celia died in South Carolina in 1891, 2 years before Abigail. She never told anyone beyond that Freedmen's Bureau interviewer about the daughter stolen from her in 1840. The story remained obscure until 1978, when a historian discovered Celia's testimony and began investigating. The trail led to Margaret's journal, to Ruth's deathbed confession, to Abigail's letters, and finally to DNA testing in 2003 that confirmed what the documents suggested. Abigail was genetically the daughter of Celia and Thomas Whitmore. The genetic evidence revealed something else. Approximately 87 of Abigail's descendants living today have African ancestry they didn't know about. Ancestry that traces back to Celia through a surrogacy arrangement that was never meant to be discovered. The Ashland Grove case reveals something disturbing about reproductive exploitation in the plantation system. Margaret wasn't using Celia's body to produce enslaved laborers. She was using it to produce a white heir, to solve a fertility problem, to preserve her own social standing by stealing not just Celia's labor but her very maternity. This was reproductive theft in its purest form, taking not just the products of a woman's body, but the relationship itself, the identity of mother, the acknowledgement that birth had even occurred. Margaret's plan required erasing Celia from her own daughter's life so completely that Abigail grew up not even knowing there was someone to miss. And unlike breeding practices that at least acknowledged enslaved women as mothers, Margaret's arrangement demanded absolute negation. Celia couldn't be allowed to exist as Abigail's mother in any sense. She had to be rendered invisible, sold away, removed from memory itself. The case also reveals how precarious whiteness was as a social category. Abigail was legally white as long as people believed Margaret's story, but the moment questions arose, that whiteness became unstable, revealing how much racial identity depended not on biology, but on social acceptance and carefully maintained fictions. Margaret's desperation speaks to impossible pressures on elite Southern women to produce heirs. What was unusual was her audacity in finding a solution that violated both racial boundaries and maternal bonds. She was willing to traumatize an enslaved woman, steal a child, and deceive her husband for life, all to avoid the social death of barrenness. Celia's choice to remain silent in 1867 reveals perhaps the cruelest aspect of the whole story. Even after emancipation, even after gaining the legal right to claim her daughter, Celia understood that doing so would harm Abigail more than help her. The theft was so complete that there was no path to justice that didn't require destroying the daughter she'd never been allowed to love. Today, the descendants of Abigail Whitmore are wrestling with what it means to discover this history. Some have embraced their connection to Celia. Others have rejected the revelation. Still others occupy uncertain middle ground, unsure how to integrate a stolen surrogacy into their understanding of family history. What's not in question is the documented truth. In 1839, a plantation mistress used her power over an enslaved woman's body to solve her fertility problem through a form of surrogacy that perfectly embodied slavery's logic of treating human beings as resources to be exploited and discarded when no longer needed. For 12 years, she maintained the deception so successfully that even her husband didn't know his daughter was the product of an arranged conception with a woman he'd raped on his wife's instructions. This is what Margaret Whitmore understood, that power over other people's bodies enables theft so profound it can erase maternity itself, replace biological truth with social fiction, and maintain deceptions across generations. The real horror of the Ashland Grove surrogacy wasn't just that it happened, it's that it worked.